They said it was just another wild horse. But when a lone ranger found a massive black stallion wounded silent and bearing a strange burned scar, she knew something was wrong. What began as an act of kindness soon spiraled into a chilling discovery. Because that scar wasn't natural. It was a mark, a brand, a warning. And the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized this horse hadn't just survived something terrible. He had escaped it. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The first storms of December had come hard across the Tetons, sealing the mountains in white and leaving the valleys hushed under their weight. Snow clung to the tall firs like thick coats of wool, bowing their branches, and the wind carried the kind of bite that cut through fabric and into skin. By mid-morning, the clouds hung low, a pale shroud, pressed against the peaks, and the light was thin and colorless. Every sound carried differently in winter, muffled, muted, except when the wind came rushing through the canyons, turning the silence into a hollow moan. On that morning, the forest looked timeless. No trails, no footprints save for a few deep impressions left by elk moving along a ridgeline days before. The powder had crusted into hard banks that gleamed like glass where the sun tried to break through. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied a sound too sharp and too lonely to belong here. It echoed faintly, carried down a slope, then faded until it might have been mistaken for the groan of ice shifting on the river. Closer at hand, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Scattered through the forest, tucked against tree lines or along the frozen stream's cabins, sent up their thin plumes into the winter air. The smoke mingled with the resinous scent of pine, a fragrance sharp enough to cut the cold. It gave the land the look of a painting serene, still yet never entirely safe. Underneath the calm, there was always the hint of something else, the feeling of eyes in the timber or the weight of a storm brewing behind the ridges. Claire Dawson paused on the crest of a hill, boots sunk ankle-deep in crusted snow. She was 34 tall and wiry, her shoulders square beneath the faded olive jacket of her ranger's uniform. A wool cap held back the dark brown hair that curled just slightly at her neck, and her cheeks burned red from the cold. She carried herself like someone who knew the land well, calm, deliberate, as though the weight of the forest was no burden to her. She drew in a breath and exhaled, watching the vapors stream into the brittle air. Her gloved hand rested on the strap of her pack, where maps and a battered radio jostled against a notebook full of handwritten observations. This was her stretch of Bridger Teton, nearly 200 square miles of rugged forest meadows and highland scrubland that stretched to the foot of the mountains. Most of it she could have traced in her sleep. Every trail, every ridgeline, every stream bend had been walked a dozen times since she'd taken this post. Solitude was part of the job. Some rangers found it unbearable. Claire found it comforting. Her cabin sat 30 minutes' drive from the nearest town, perched above a narrow gorge. She lived without television, without decent internet, with only a shortwave radio and the scratchy voice of dispatch in the evenings. The silence of it fit her. There was no one to interrupt her thoughts, no need to explain herself to neighbors. The only companions she kept were the files stacked in her cabinet, years of notes on the wild horses that roamed the valleys. Each herd cataloged each stallion or mare, identified by marking scars or quirks of temperament. They were her community as much as the people in town. She remembered them the way others might remember relatives, by nicknames, by the places they liked to graze, by the sound of their calls in spring. She had once stood down a group of poachers who were driving a band of Mustangs toward a box canyon. She had done it without firing a shot, simply refusing to move from the mouth of the canyon, steady with her badge and her voice. The report had earned her recognition from the state office. But it wasn't the commendation she remembered most. It was the sight of the mustangs turning back into the hills' tails, high scattering into freedom. Lately, though, her notes had grown darker. Over the past month, something had been happening. Reports came in from ranchers and hikers near the edges of the forest. Entire herds of wild horses had gone missing. One week, there had been fresh tracks leading to the watering holes. The next, nothing. 6 herds gone in less than 30 days, without a trace left behind. Claire had ridden out to check the valleys herself. The snow revealed strange things. At one meadow, she had found broad drag marks through the snow, as though heavy panels had been pulled across the ground. At another, she found boot prints, large, military-sized, stamped into the mud near the creek, leading to tire tracks that cut across a stretch of land where no vehicles were permitted. Hunters had whispered to her of drones spotted hovering low at night, chasing horses with the mechanical whine of propellers driving them into waiting trailers. A young conservation intern had told her in hushed tones of tire ruts slashing across a closed hunting zone too recent to dismiss. But there were no bodies, no spent cartridges, no blood. Nothing that could be written into a report as proof. Whoever was taking the horses was careful, professional, clean, and always one step ahead. The official line from the district office was simple. The horses had migrated lower, seeking winter forage. It happened. Populations shifted. But Claire knew these valleys too well. Mustangs did not vanish wholesale, not 6 herds in a month, not without leaving some sign of where they had gone. One evening, she sat by her wood stove, flipping through her files. The glow of the fire painted her cabin walls with restless orange shadows. She ran her finger down the columns of her logbook, marking off the herds that had disappeared. At least 40 horses unaccounted for. She tapped the page with her pen and muttered, "Where the hell did you go?" The logs gave her no answer. What she remembered, though, was Utah in 2019. She had been a junior ranger then, with little more than her badge and a stubborn streak. A series of disappearances in the desert ranges had been dismissed as migration. Claire hadn't accepted it. She had tracked the signs herself, followed the rumors, and uncovered a holding pen hidden in the sagebrush. That pen had led to an investigation and eventually to a trafficking ring that was shipping wild horses across state lines. She had been right then, though few believed her, until the evidence was undeniable. Now, years later, she felt the same cold certainty creeping back into her gut. At the station, a few colleagues raised eyebrows when she mentioned her suspicions. One laughed outright. "You see ghosts where there aren't any, Dawson. Horses move. It's winter. Don't make this into something it's not." She didn't argue. She had learned better than to push against brick walls. Instead, she wrote it down. She kept her own files, marked her own maps. Each night after patrol, she would spread the maps across her table, tracing lines between the places where the herds had last been seen. The pins formed a pattern. They clustered near the eastern prairie, a stretch of land that bordered private property. No cameras. No patrol stations within 20 miles. A perfect place to make animals vanish. The cabin grew cold as she worked the fire, dying low. Claire sat with her mug of coffee cooling beside her hand, staring at the circles she had drawn on the map. Loneliness pressed in around her, but it wasn't the kind that came from being alone. It was the kind that came from not being believed. She could have filled the cabin with people and still felt it, the weight of knowing something true and carrying it alone. That night, the wind picked up. Snow rattled against the windows, a fine spray like sand. Claire stepped outside to stack another load of wood. Her boots crunched over the crusted drifts. The air was sharp enough to burn her lungs. She had just bent to drop a log into the pile when a sound rolled through the forest. A single horse's whinny, deep and drawn out so full of strain that it made the hair on her neck stand up. She froze listening. The sound came again, distant but unmistakable. Claire straightened slowly, the logs slipping from her arms into the snow. She scanned the trees, but the night was too dark, the storm too thick. Nothing moved but the wind. Still, the echo lingered inside her, long after the forest had fallen silent again. She whispered into the night almost without meaning to, "Who's still out there?" The morning broke gray and brittle, the kind of cold that iced the windows from the inside and turned every exhale into fog. Claire had barely poured the first cup of coffee when the phone on the counter began to ring. The sound was harsh in the quiet cabin, a shrill reminder that her solitude was always a little more fragile than she liked to think. She set the mug down, crossed the small kitchen, and lifted the receiver. The caller ID showed the Ross Diner, the old roadside cafe that had been feeding truckers and hikers for decades. Evelyn Ross rarely called this early. Claire Evelyn's voice rushed through, breathless and trembling. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else there's a horse. A big one. Standing out by the tree line near the service road, black as coal. I swear I've never seen anything like it. There's blood on its shoulder, dried up, but it's not moving, just standing there." Claire straightened, pulling the pencil from behind her ear. She scribbled on the notepad beside the phone. "Where exactly you know the old clearing by the fire break, where they used to run the sweep crews 10 years ago, right on the edge of the sagebrush flats." Claire marked the spot with quick strokes, already visualizing the route. Evelyn had called her before about an injured buck tangled in wire, about a fox kit crying near the dumpsters. The woman's compassion was impulsive but never misplaced. "Thank you," Claire said. "Stay back. Don't let anyone near it. I'll handle it." She hung up, moving with practiced efficiency. Coffee abandoned, she pulled on her heavier parka, shoved the medical kit into her satchel, checked the flashlight batteries, and clipped her radio to her belt. Within minutes, the cabin doors slammed shut behind her, the crunch of boots carrying her to the waiting patrol truck. The drive was slow, the snow packed into ridges of ice that made the tires shudder. A curtain of fog hung over the flats, blurring the line between earth and sky. The temperature gauge on the dashboard hovered at 5 below. Claire parked a good distance from the coordinates Evelyn had given her, killed the engine, and stepped into the stillness. At first, there was only white snow fog, the pale silhouettes of trees. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A shadow cut against the landscape, towering and solitary. At first glance, it could have been a black boulder left by a glacier, but it shifted, breathed, and resolved into the form of a horse. Claire drew a slow breath and closed the truck door without a sound. She let the quiet swallow her as she approached on foot, each step sinking into the crusted snow. The air was thin, the silence deep enough to press against her eardrums. The horse stood motionless on the open ground, as though carved from stone. Its coat was a dark so absolute it seemed to drink in the light. No halter, no rope, no sign of a herd. Just one massive stallion alone. She stopped to 20 paces away and took in the details. He was enormous, easily 17 hands at the shoulder, close to 170 centimeters high. The thick muscles of his chest and haunches spoke of power. But there was weariness in the way he held his head, the subtle shift of his weight off one swollen hind leg. Dried blood clung to his shoulder, matted the sleek fur into clumps. Her eyes caught on the scar. On the left shoulder, half buried in the coarse black coat, a circle of burned flesh gleamed pale and puckered, its edges drawn tight. It wasn't the jagged wound of accident. It was deliberate. A brand. Claire's jaw tightened. The horse's eyes lifted to hers. They were amber, not the soft brown of most Mustangs, but a fierce, smoldering gold. They didn't roll in fear, didn't glaze with wildness. They watched her, assessed her. She lowered her stance, knees bent, shoulders relaxed, palms visible. Her voice was low, carrying only enough to reach him. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The fog curled between them, softening the world to two figures, the woman and the horse locked in a cautious standoff. She eased a hand toward her satchel fingers, brushing the zipper of the medical kit. The stallion's ears flicked forward. Then, without warning, he moved. One step. Slow. Controlled. Snow crushed under the weight of his hoof. Claire froze, breath caught in her chest. Another step, deliberate. He closed the distance until only a yard remained between them. His breath clouded the air, hot against her chilled skin. She didn't reach out. She didn't dare. She simply stood, every muscle still letting him decide. The horse lowered his head. The velvet of his muzzle brushed against the fabric of her pants just above her boot. It was a touch so light she almost doubted it. But it was enough. Her exhale trembled, fogging the air. This was not the reaction of a feral Mustang. This was an animal that had known people, once had learned trust, or something like it. Yet in those golden eyes, she saw something that was no longer just animal. There was intelligence there. A weight of memory, and beneath it, a shadow of pain that was more than physical. Claire clicked her radio, the whisper of static filling the quiet. "Base, this is Dawson. I've located a large horse near R12. Black stallion, injured shoulder, no visible owner. I'll be bringing him in for observation." She unclipped the emergency blanket from her pack and moved slowly, letting the fabric rustle against the cold. With steady hands, she draped it over the stallion's broad back, careful not to press against the scar. He flinched, but didn't bolt. "Easy, big guy," she murmured. "We'll get you warm. We'll get you safe." She gathered the lead rope from her bag, looped it loosely around his neck, not tying it, just giving the semblance of connection. He followed when she stepped forward, limping but steady. The walk back to the truck was long snow crunching beneath them, fog folding around their shapes. She spoke to him as they went, voice steady and quiet, as if words alone could soothe the ghosts in his eyes. "You've been through a storm, haven't you? Whatever it was, you're still standing. That counts for something." She glanced back once, catching the way his coat swallowed the dim light, a darkness so complete it seemed to strip the world of color around him. Loading him into the patrol truck was an exercise in patience. The stallion balked at the ramp, nostrils flaring, hooves striking sparks from the frozen metal. But Claire stood calm, letting him test, giving him time. Finally, with a snort, he stepped up and into the open bed. She secured the side rails, tossed hay into the corner, and closed the gate. Driving back, she kept the radio low, letting the crackle of an old country station hum through the cab. Behind her, in the open bed, the black horse stood tall despite his limp ears, pricked eyes reflecting the pale morning. Claire checked the rearview mirror more than once. His gaze never wavered. She thought aloud, almost to herself, "You're like a shadow that moves, quiet as mist." But those eyes... She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Like fire in the dark. For a long stretch of road, she said nothing, just listened to the rumble of the engine and the stallion's steady breathing. Then softly she tried the words again. "Nix," she said. The name tasted right. "That's you." The horse flicked an ear head, shifting slightly at the sound. "Nix," she repeated, firmer. "All right then, that's your name." The stallion turned one amber eye toward the cab. For a heartbeat, Claire could have sworn he understood. She smiled, not the tired smile of duty, but something quieter, warmer. She had no way of knowing what he had endured, no way of erasing the scar burned into his flesh. But in that moment, barreling down an icy road with a horse the size of a nightmare in her truck bed, she felt less alone than she had in months. By the time Claire rolled back into the ranger station, the last of the daylight had vanished. The mountain ridge behind her was a dark wall rimmed faintly in silver by the rising moon. Frost had already glazed the wooden rails around the paddock, catching the lantern light in brittle sparks. Nix stepped down from the trailer without resistance. He moved stiffly, the swollen leg awkward, but steady, his head carried high, despite the blood still caked along his shoulder. Claire guided him toward the holding stall beside her cabin, the pen she kept for rescues deer with a broken leg, an eagle stunned after colliding with a truck windshield, the occasional elk calf lost from its herd. Never before had she led something like this through the gate. The stall was simple timber walls, a layer of fresh hay, a heat lamp angled in one corner. There were no chains, no ropes. She didn't tie him. She wanted to see if he would stay. He did. Nix crossed the threshold with a low exhale, as though the space was his to claim. His amber eyes flicked to her, once then to the corners of the stall, cataloging every shadow. Claire dropped her satchel on a bench and pulled on latex gloves. She worked with practiced calm. The gash on his shoulder she cleaned first, rinsing away the dried blood with warm saline, until the scar tissue around it gleamed raw and pale. The smell of antiseptic hung sharp in the cold air. Nix flinched, once muscles tightening, but he didn't strike or pull away. "You're a big one, aren't you?" she murmured as she pressed gauze over the wound, wrapping a clean bandage tight across the breadth of his chest. "Big enough to scare off anything in these woods. And still someone managed to hurt you." He breathed out a heavy gust against her shoulder and stood still while she bound the leg. The swelling at the hock was obvious, a bruise, maybe a strain. She packed snow into a cloth, pressed it carefully against the joint. Nix shifted but didn't lash out. Only his eyes moved, following every motion of her hands. Hours slipped by in the quiet rhythm of tending. When she finally stepped back, stripping off her gloves, Nix stood bandaged and calmer, his head lowered to the fresh water she'd set out. His breath steamed above the bucket. Claire leaned on the rail, watching the slow rise and fall of his sides, the scar on his shoulder gleaming white in the lantern light. Night fell faster than she expected. By the time she closed the paddock gate and stepped into her cabin, the forest was already sealed in shadow. Snow sifted down in soft curtains, whispering against the roof. Inside, she fed kindling into the stove until the fire caught the dry pine crackling bright. The warmth spread slowly through the room, chasing the damp chill from her gloves and hair. She sat at the small desk under the window, opening her field journal. The pen scratched against the page stallion black. 17 hands. Scar on left shoulder consistent with illegal branding iron. Subject calm under treatment. No signs of aggression. Response more akin to conditioned animal than feral mustang. She paused, tapping the pen against her lip. Her eyes drifted to the window. Outside, beyond the yellow glow of the paddock lamp, Nix lay on the hay, his long frame folded carefully, head resting against the boards. The snowflakes caught on his dark coat, melting into damp stars. Claire set the journal aside and poured herself tea. The steam rose fragrant, mingling with the smoke of the fire. She held the mug between her palms, staring at the quiet silhouette outside. A horse that lets a stranger tend him. That walks willingly into a stall, but carries a scar like that. She whispered into the empty room. "Where were you before I found you, and who did this to you?" The only answer was the pop of the firewood. For a while, the night felt peaceful, ordinary. It was close to midnight when the peace broke. The first sound was faint, a low growl on the edge of the wind. Claire stirred in her chair, unsure if she had imagined it. Then it came again, stronger this time, the guttural rumble of a diesel engine. Somewhere out on the service road, a truck was grinding its way past. The noise rolled through the forest like thunder in a canyon, metallic and deep, vibrating in her chest. From the stall outside came a sudden, violent crash. Claire was on her feet in an instant, yanking on her boots, shoving through the cabin door. The cold slapped her face as she sprinted across the snow. The lantern above the paddock swung wildly, casting fractured light across the boards. Nix was no longer the silent, watchful giant she had met that morning. He was a storm made flesh. His body crashed against the stall walls, hooves pounding, sending thuds that rattled the timber. His breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes wide whites flashing crimson in the lamplight. The bandage on his shoulder had slipped, trailing loose. He threw his weight against the rail, the wood groaning, shuddering under the impact. His mane was wild, tossing as if electricity ran through every hair. A hoarse, guttural whinny tore from his throat, half scream, half roar. Nix, Claire shouted, stopping just short of the rail. He didn't hear her. Or if he did, the sound didn't reach whatever place he was trapped inside. He reared slammed-down hooves, scraping sparks from the boards. Claire kept her voice steady low, though her pulse hammered in her ears. Nix, listen to me. You're safe here. Nothing's going to touch you. But the stallion's terror was absolute blind. His gaze was locked not on her, but on the dark beyond the trees, the direction where the truck's engine still rumbled faintly. It struck her then with the cold clarity of a blade. This wasn't mere fear, it was recognition. The sound of that engine had torn open something buried deep inside him. The truck roared once more, a double blare of its horn, then faded into distance. The forest swallowed the sound. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Nix backed into the corner of the stall. His chest heaved, steam rising in thick clouds. He stood trembling, head low, sweat dampening the dark coat despite the freezing air. Claire held the rail, her breath misting in the light. She didn't step closer. Not yet. She waited, giving him space, until his eyes blinked the fire, dimming to exhausted embers. When the silence returned, it was heavy. Only the creak of the rafters and the whisper of snow filled the void. Claire drew her flashlight, clicking it on its beam, soft and white. She scanned the bandages. No fresh blood, no torn muscle, only the same wounds she had dressed earlier. His panic had been all memory, not present injury. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It's over. Just a truck, she said, her voice hoarse. No one's coming to take you away now. Nick stood with his head bowed sides, shuddering, every muscle taut as if he'd just run miles. His ears twitched toward her words, but his gaze stayed distant. She spoke again, quieter, like she was speaking not just to him, but to herself. It's finished, Nix. Whatever they did, it ends here. After a long moment, she stepped back, closing the stall gate firmly. She lingered, her eyes drawn again and again to the pale scar on his shoulder. Back inside the cabin, she opened her journal once more, her handwriting tight, urgent. Subject exhibited acute panic response to diesel engine noise. Severity beyond instinctive fear, indicative of trauma conditioning. Possible history captivity, illegal transport abuse. She underlined the last word. Abuse. The fire had burned low by the time she finally tried to rest. She lay in bed, the wool blanket drawn to her chin, but sleep would not come easily. The cabin walls creaked, snow slid in soft drifts from the roof, and her mind replayed the image of Nix's eyes flashing red in the lamplight. At last, she turned to the window. Outside, in the muted glow of the paddock lantern, Nix stood again, not lying down, not at rest. His head faced east, the direction the truck had gone. He was still, but every line of his body pointed outward as though listening for an enemy just beyond the horizon. Claire swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "How many more of you are out there?" she whispered. "And how many didn't come back?" Her lids grew heavy, her thoughts circling. The scar burned in her mind's eye, the deliberate brand, the mark of ownership, not by chance but by cruelty. Just before sleep claimed her, one thought burned clear. If Nix survived a capture, then that scar isn't just pain. It's a sign, a code, a warning, or a mark left by someone who never wanted him to be free. The wind rose again, moaning through the trees. Claire drifted into uneasy dreams, the sound of hooves and engines mingling in her sleep. Morning rose pale and reluctant over Bridger Teton, the kind of winter light that never quite felt like day. The sun was only a muted smear behind heavy cloud, a faint suggestion of warmth with no heat in it. The forest lay hushed, muffled under fresh snowfall. Claire fastened the ramp of her small transport truck, coaxing Nix up with quiet words. He hesitated at first, ears swiveling at the metallic clatter of the hinge, but she didn't press. Instead, she stood at his shoulder, her hand light on the rope that wasn't even tied, simply draped as a gesture of direction. Eventually, with a wary snort, he stepped inside. She didn't strap him down, didn't cinch ropes around his chest or tie his head short like most handlers would. Something in her gut told her restraint would only make the shadows in him flare. Instead, she closed the gate softly and climbed into the cab. The road to Jackson wound through frozen valleys, the truck tires humming over packed ice. Inside the covered trailer, Nix was almost silent. Once or twice, she glanced into the mirror and caught his eyes, amber burning through the dim, fixed forward, as though measuring every turn of the road. "You don't have to trust me," she said aloud, her voice soft against the rattle of the heater. "Just let me help." She didn't bother with the radio. No music, no chatter, only the steady whisper of snow against the windshield and the thrum of wheels on the frost-bitten highway. 40 minutes stretched long, a silence shared between woman and horse, as heavy as the questions riding with them. Dr. Samuel Harker's clinic sat at the edge of Jackson, where the town gave way to ranch land. It was a squat red brick building with peeling white trim, flanked by a small corral and a barn that had seen better decades. A wooden sign above the door read, "Harker Veterinary Services," in faded paint and the letters softened by time and weather. Claire parked close to the side gate and climbed out, pulling her collar high against the wind. From the porch, a tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, but lean, his gait long and deliberate. His hair was steel gray, combed neatly back from a lined forehead. Even under layers of wool, his movements carried the ease of long practice. "Dawson," he greeted, his voice a low rumble. "If you'd called ahead, I could have warmed the stall for you." Claire allowed a wry smile. Didn't want to risk him waiting longer than he had to. Harker's eyes shifted to the truck. When Nix stepped down into the cold air, the older man's brows rose. "Lord above," he muttered. "That's no ordinary Mustang. Black as midnight, big as a draft horse. Where'd you pull this shadow from Western Flats near the old fire break?" Claire said, steadying the lead as Nix's hooves touched ground. "He came to me like he'd been waiting." Harker gave a sharp whistle under his breath. "Well, he doesn't look like the type to stand quiet in a pen. Let's see what we're dealing with." He led them into the examination bay, a wide stall floored with rubber mats, heat lamps casting an amber glow overhead. The air smelled of iodine and hay. Nix paused at the threshold, sniffing ears twitching at the hum of fluorescent lights. Claire murmured encouragement, and he stepped inside his shadow, filling the space. The exam began methodically. Harker moved around Nix with the calm efficiency of decades in the field, pressing at joints, lifting hooves, checking pulse and respiration. The stallion bore it all with tense stillness, shifting occasionally, but never striking out. Strong heart, Harker noted. Leg swelling's a strain. Nothing lasting if he rests. He checked reflexes, eyes, teeth, all the while muttering observations. Nix tolerated it, though his gaze never left Claire, as though she were the tether holding him in place. Then Harker brushed back the thick black coat over Nix's left shoulder. His hand stilled. Well, now he breathed. Claire stepped closer. Beneath the lamp, the scar showed clearly a circle almost perfect wide as a bottle cap. The skin was puckered white, rimmed with faint cracks, where the flesh had burned deep. In the center, small black pinpoints dotted the scar remnants of seared follicles that had never grown hair again. Harker's face hardened and the warmth in his eyes narrowing to flint. That, he said flatly, is no ranch brand. Claire's throat tightened. You're sure? Look at it. No letters, no numbers, no symbols. Rancher's brand for identification. Breeders mark bloodlines. But this, he touched the edge gently, Nix, flinching under the contact. This is a ring of hot iron pressed for no reason but ownership. A mark to say this one is ours. No record, no registry. Deliberate anonymity. Claire swallowed. Then, what is it? Harker's straightened eyes grim. I've seen it before, not often. The kind of mark used by traffickers. They move Mustangs through holding sites, brand them quick so they can tell whose shipment is whose. It's not legal, not humane. And it sure as hell doesn't belong on a free horse. The words hung in the warm air like frost. Harker circled his expression dark. I worked on a case in Nevada back in 2018. We found a holding yard full of wild stock, half-starved, waiting to be loaded onto trailers bound for God knows where. Every one of them carried marks like this, plain circles, triangle shapes with no meaning except to the ones running the racket. That was the first and last time I hoped I'd ever see such a thing. He shook his head. And now, here it is again. Claire's fingers brushed unconsciously at her own collar, as though the scar burned her skin as well. So he didn't escape a ranch. No, Harker said, voice low. If I had to wager, he escaped a system. The weight of that settled between them. Nix shifted the chainless halter, rattling lightly. He stood proud and silent, but the scar told his story in a voice older than any of them. The ride back was quieter than the one before. Snow fell steadily, dusting the windshield, muting the outline of the mountains. Claire kept both hands firm on the wheel, her recorder propped against the dash. Her voice was calm but taut as she spoke into it. Black Stallion estimated 17 hands. Responds to human presence with conditioned stillness. Displays acute panic to diesel engine sounds. Scar on left shoulder, circular brand illegal. No evidence of long-term halter wear. Suggests captivity without traditional ranch handling. She clicked the recorder off, let the silence deepen. In the mirror, Nix's eyes burned faint gold, half hidden in shadow. At a stoplight on the edge of town, she unfolded her field map. The pins she had stuck over the past weeks glared back at her, marking where herds had vanished. Each cluster fell within a radius reachable by truck in less than 2 days. Each point connected like links in a chain. Her hand tightened around the wheel. Nix wasn't just a stray. He was the survivor of something bigger than the one piece of evidence she could touch. The scar was more than a wound. It was a thread leading back into the dark. By the time she reached the ranger station, the snow had thickened veils of white drifting across the road. She parked, leaving the engine ticking, and sat for a moment in the quiet cab. Beside her, Nix lifted his head, nostrils flaring at the scent of pine and smoke. His gaze turned east toward the wilderness, as if measuring the miles back to wherever he had come from. Claire rested her forehead against the wheel, then whispered almost a vow they couldn't erase that scar. But maybe I can follow it back. Maybe I can shut down the fire that made it. Snowflakes tapped against the windshield like ash falling from some unseen blaze. Claire closed her eyes for a beat, then straightened her decision, settling like stone in her chest. The Ross Diner was half full at midday, the air thick with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Snowmelt dripped from boots, lined up by the door, and the windows were fogged with condensation from the cold outside. Claire pushed through, stamping the slush from her boots, her hat tucked low over her brow. Evelyn Ross looked up from behind the counter. Her face lit briefly with recognition, then tightened with something more urgent. She bustled out from behind the register, wiping her hands on her apron. "You picked a fine day to come in," she murmured, ushering Claire toward the corner booth. Claire slid into the seat, already sensing the gravity in the woman's tone. Evelyn leaned close, her voice dropping until it was almost swallowed by the chatter of the diner. "2 nights ago, she said I saw a truck. Big one. Dark green, no plates. Rolled past the tree line near the old logging road." She hesitated, lowering her eyes. "And I heard it loud, even over the engine. Horses, but not like wild ones out on the flats. This was screaming like they were in pain." Claire's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her pulse ticking. "You're sure?" Evelyn nodded, her curls bobbing. "I know the sound of a horse that's hurt Claire. I've run this diner long enough to see ranchers bring in half the county when they've lost one. This wasn't just noise. It was suffering." "What time?" Claire asked. "Close to midnight." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her, worried. "Same night you came barreling through here with that black giant." I didn't want to connect it, but Claire leaned back, her mind slotting pieces into place. Midnight, diesel engines, Nix's violent panic in the stall, and now Evelyn's testimony, a green truck, horses crying out. It fit too well, too perfectly to ignore. If Nix wasn't imagining his fear, Claire thought grimly, then the ones still out there are living his nightmare. By late afternoon, she had packed what she needed. A flashlight with fresh batteries, her binoculars, the weatherproof map marked with red pins, and the service revolver issued to her as part of her ranger's kit. She strapped her radio to her belt, but kept it turned low. She didn't log the trip officially. There was no evidence admissible enough to justify a search warrant, and no backup would be sent without one. This was reconnaissance, nothing more. Nothing she would admit to if it went wrong. Nix walked beside her, not bridled, not saddled, only a rope looped loose at his chest. She hadn't the heart to mount him. It felt wrong to ask more from him than he'd already given. He matched her stride with steady patience, his breath pluming white against the oncoming dusk. They followed the faint grooves left in the slush tire tracks, partially covered by fresh snow cutting across the low fields. They wound through stands of aspen and across a shallow creek crusted with ice. The tracks led straight to the old logging camp. The place had been shuttered for nearly a decade. Once it had been a staging yard for trucks and timber, but now the sheds sagged, their roofs furred with moss. Rusted fuel drums stood in a crooked line. A skeletal frame of machinery leaned against the sky ribs of steel picked bare by time. At the center, the main warehouse squatted corrugated metal sheets bolted onto a wooden skeleton, its windows dark, its walls streaked with rust. Snow had gathered thick in the shadows of its eaves, and silence pressed heavy on the place. No signs of habitation, no tire marks fresh enough to prove recent traffic. But Evelyn's words echoed a green truck horse's screaming. Twilight deepened into blue shadow as Claire and Nix skirted the tree line. The forest around them was unnaturally still, as if even the wind refused to stir. Dead leaves shifted under her boots with a brittle crackle, every sound magnified in the hush. She laid a hand on Nix's neck, signaling him to halt, and moved forward alone. His ears flicked, his body taut, but he obeyed, waiting just inside the cover of the trees. Claire crouched low, the cold biting into her knees as she crept toward the warehouse. The smell reached her, first ammonia and rot, the unmistakable stench of animals confined too long in damp straw. Her throat tightened. There was a gap in the siding where two panels of sheet metal no longer met flush. She pressed close, pulled the small flashlight from her jacket, and shielded the beam with her hand as she angled it through the crack. The light fell across a line of cages, steel bars, straw dark with waste. Shapes moved within ribs, jutting under patchy coats, eyes glinting eerily as they caught the thin beam. The sound came next, a restless pounding of hooves against metal, the dull thud of desperation. One horse lifted its head, eyes reflecting green lips peeled back in a silent scream. Another shifted chains, clinking as it tugged at its restraint. Claire's hand tightened around the flashlight. 4, maybe 5. Not wild and free, but penned like criminals, skin stretched tight over bones. A sound split the silence, a broken whinny, raw and ragged like breath forced through a torn throat. Even from his post in the trees, Nix reacted. His head shot up, ears locked forward, muscles coiled as if to charge. The sound cut through the years and miles between him and them. It was the cry he had once made the echo of his own captivity. Claire pressed closer to the crack, her pulse hammering. The warehouse door clanged open. She flinched back, dousing the light, flattening into the shadow of the wall. Boots scuffed on the icy ground. A man stepped out, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, faded gray, and a black knit cap pulled low. He leaned against the siding with the practiced posture of someone who had stood watch 100 nights before. His breath fogged in the cold, his eyes restless as they swept the yard. Claire held still, scarcely breathing. The ember of his cigarette flared as he drew, then dimmed again, casting brief shadows across a narrow, weather-hardened face. Jonas Hale. She recognized him at once. The name flickered in her memory from incident reports months old. He'd been a foreman at the stone quarry north of town until 8 months ago, when his record stopped cold. There had been whispers after that, sightings of him at late-night auctions, murmurs that he was brokering animals out of Idaho. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Until now. And here he was, guarding a warehouse filled with stolen Mustangs. Her hand moved instinctively to the small notepad in her breast pocket. She scribbled fast, her pencil trembling against the paper mail approx. 6'1" gray canvas coat, black knit cap stationed at side entrance. Structure metal siding, interior cages, estimated 5 horses visible. Evidence of confinement. She tucked the pad away, her breath steadying. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was evidence if she lived long enough to deliver it. A gust of wind rattled the siding, and Jonas turned his head sharply, squinting into the darkness. Claire froze, pressing her body to the wall. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of his cigarette. Then, satisfied, he exhaled smoke and went back to his vigil. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She edged backward, retracing her steps toward the tree line. Nix waited, his body still taut, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. He didn't spook at her approach. He only flicked his ears, then cast one last glance toward the building, his gaze lingering, resolute. She touched his shoulder lightly, signaling retreat. He followed without protest, though every line of him radiated refusal, as though leaving those cages behind was a betrayal. "I know," she whispered as they slipped into the cover of trees. "I saw it too. But we can't prove it yet. Not like this." The snow swallowed their tracks as they withdrew the warehouse, shrinking into the dark behind them. Back at the ranger truck, Claire secured Nix with a loose rope and leaned against the cold metal door. Her breath fogged out in heavy bursts, her pulse finally slowing. She looked back toward the forest, the warehouse hidden beyond the ridgeline, the memory of those gaunt horses still burning in her eyes. "They're in there," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I can't free them tonight, but I will." Nix stood still, his amber gaze fixed on the horizon, ears tilted toward the cries that still echoed in both their minds. There was no fear in him now, only the quiet weight of recognition and something that felt almost like mourning. Claire's jaw set. She reached into her pocket and touched the pencil scratches on the notepad. The evidence was thin, but it was a beginning. Enough to convince someone willing to listen. Enough to take the first step toward tearing the rest open. As the truck engine turned over, headlights sweeping across the trees, she whispered one last vow to the night. "I've seen it. Now I just have to prove it." The following morning dawned bleak and pale, a smear of winter sun behind clouds the color of ash. Claire stood in the operations room of the county sheriff's office, the stale smell of old coffee mingling with damp wool and gun oil. On the wall, a map of the Bridger Teton perimeter was pinned with red markers, each one of them hers. She laid out her notes, her sketches of the warehouse, the description of Jonas Hale, the cries of horses behind corrugated steel. The sheriff, a broad man with deep lines of suspicion carved into his brow, listened without interruption. When she finished, silence lingered like a held breath. It was Deputy Laura Briggs who finally broke it. "I've worked with Dawson before," she said, her voice firm. "She doesn't deal in ghost stories. If she says there are horses in there, there are horses." Laura's presence steadied Claire more than she let on. The deputy was 5 years her senior, her auburn hair always tucked neat under her Stetson, her manner brisk and no nonsense. They had chased poachers together through storm and snow. They had shared firelight in mountain cabins and backed each other in front of judges who doubted their word. Trust between them ran deep. Now Laura tapped a finger on the map. Jonas Hale's name already floated in Idaho market reports. Claire's sighting makes it solid. "We need a team." The sheriff exhaled. "We'll request a warrant from the county judge. Emergency status. If we wait, they'll move the stock." Within hours, the paperwork came through crisp signatures and official seals stamped over Claire's notes. A temporary task force was assembled, sheriff's deputies, forest enforcement officers, and a federal liaison on loan from the Bureau of Land Management. Claire was assigned as guide and field witness, the one who had seen the inside. When asked why she insisted on bringing Nix, Claire kept her voice steady. "He knows the place. He'll alert us to what we can't hear. And he won't spook like the others." She didn't add the truth that he had already carried the weight of their suffering, and she couldn't imagine him left behind while the others cried for rescue. Night settled hard over the forest when the convoy rolled out. 5 vehicles moved along back roads with their headlights killed, their wheels crunching over frozen gravel. Breath misted from lips, radios crackled in clipped whispers. The abandoned logging yard rose from the snow like a carcass, skeletal frames of rusted machinery looming against the stars. The warehouse squatted at the center, its windows black, its siding streaked with frost. Claire led the rear team through the trees, Nix walking soundlessly beside her. He blended into the shadows, only the gleam of his amber eyes marking his presence. When she raised her hand, he stopped. The men behind her crouched low, rifles ready. Her heart thudded. She could almost smell the fear inside that building, thick as ammonia. From her earpiece, Laura's voice whispered, "Go." The breacher stepped forward, clamped hydraulic jaws onto the padlocked door. The scream of tortured metal split the night. In the same instant, tactical flashlights flared. White beams cut across the interior. The warehouse exploded into clarity. The air stank of filth and neglect, sour straw, stale blood, urine that burned the throat. 2 long rows of cages lined the walls, steel welded into squares, barely large enough to hold the wild weight of a Mustang. 11 horses stood inside, gaunt, and their coats, dull eyes, glass bright against the darkness. Some had nylon straps biting into their muzzles. Others bore chains shackled to forelegs, the skin rubbed raw. The light struck them, and they did not rear or panic. They only stared, as if the intrusion was not surprise, but confirmation. Claire's boots echoed as she stepped forward, her recorder already running in her pocket. She passed stall after stall, gaze locking on scars, on ribs, on eyes that still burned. A mare pressed her forehead against the bars as though begging. A colt lay on his side, too weak to stand. Her throat tightened around the words that slipped out. It's not random. It's a system. An entire system. The deputies fanned out, weapons raised. Shouts rang sheriff's department hands, where I can see them. Movement cracked the order. From behind a stack of pallets, a man bolted, sprinting toward the emergency exit. His jacket flapped black against the light, his boots slipping on damp concrete. "Stop, sheriff's department," an officer barked. Claire's body moved before her mind caught up. "Nix, go." The stallion surged forward like thunder loosed from the earth. His hooves clanged against the concrete, reverberating through the warehouse. The men flinched, parting instinctively. Nix drove into the narrow aisle main, whipping his bulk, filling the passage. The fleeing man skidded, tried to pivot, but the horse was already there. Nix wheeled his shoulders, blocking the door, his breath erupting in clouds. He struck the ground with his forehooves, a sound like war drums. The runner fell scrambling on hands and knees, his face twisted in panic as the stallion towered above him. Nix screamed a high, tearing whinny that froze the room. 2 deputies crashed in, pinning the man's arms, twisting them behind his back. The cuffs snapped shut. Curtis Hale, younger, thinner eyes darting like a trapped weasel. Claire knew him from her files, the brother of Jonas, the shadow figure behind the warehouse. He thrashed once, then sagged under their grip. His voice cracked as they hauled him upright. "You don't get it. It wasn't me. It was never me." His words rang hollow against the roar of Nix's breathing. The cages broke open one by one. Laura and Claire moved fast, bolt cutters snapping chains, locks clattering to the floor. One mare stumbled forward, skin stretched over bones. She pressed her muzzle to Claire's chest, trembling. Claire wrapped an arm around her neck and whispered, "No one's taking you again. You're safe. It's over." Nix stood at the center of the chaos, his ears flicking from horse to horse, his eyes bright with recognition. When a thin bay stepped out, ribs jutting, he lowered his head, touched muzzles, and they exchanged a soft sound, half whicker, half sigh. Some of the deputies swallowed hard, blinking against the sight. These were not just animals freed. They were witnesses who understood freedom had returned. Veterinary teams arrived the thrum of diesel engines this time, carrying relief instead of terror. Specialized transport trailers backed into the lot ramps, lowered. Horses stepped hesitantly into the glow of floodlights, guided with gentle hands. Claire stood at Laura's shoulder, her throat raw. "If Nix hadn't come to me," she said quietly, "none of them would have lived to see this night." Laura's jaw worked, eyes soft, despite the steel of her badge. Then thank God he did. While the rescues unfolded, detectives swept the warehouse. What they uncovered told the rest of the story. Burlap sacks of feed lay stacked beside crates of unlabeled syringes. Forged transport papers were scattered across a desk, ink smudged but legible. One notebook listed numbers in tight script: 15 horses, 9 branded, 3 shipped, departure 3 days. Another page bore sketches of the brand circles, triangles, simple lines burned into flesh as identifiers. Proof enough to tie the scars to an organized trade. Curtis Hale sat cuffed against the wall, his head in his hands, refusing to meet anyone's eye. Officers bagged the papers, photographed the cages, marked the locations of chains and muzzles. Claire documented every scar she could find, her camera clicking steadily as she moved from horse to horse. Her stomach clenched when she saw them, 3 burns identical to Nix's, seared in flesh across shoulders and hips. The same nameless circle, replicated, methodical. She lowered the camera dial sharp at the back of her throat. They were branding them like parcels, not even pretending these were lives. Laura's hand squeezed her shoulder. "Now we can prove it." Dawn bled pale over the tree line as the last of the rescued horses was loaded into the trailers. The convoy of veterinary vans pulled away, headlights glowing against the new fallen snow. The air felt cleaner for their absence, though the stench of confinement still clung to the warehouse. Inside, the silence was deafening. Empty cages gaped like open graves. Nix lingered, his hooves planted firmly, his gaze sweeping over the emptiness. He stood as if unwilling to leave, as though his presence was a barrier against the memory of chains. Claire walked to him, her steps soft on the straw. She laid a hand on his neck, feeling the heat of his skin under her palm. His breath was steady now, the tremor gone, but his eyes stayed locked on the stalls. "We found them," she whispered. "Not all, not yet. But this place won't hurt another one." Nix blew out a long breath, from a warm mist enveloping her hand. At last he turned, following her lead, out into the fresh air. Laura stood waiting by the doorway, her rifle slung across her chest. She offered a tired smile. "Well, Ranger, looks like you've got yourself more than a suspicion now." Claire's eyes followed the retreating vans, her expression set in quiet fire. "I won't stop, Laura. However many there are left, I'll bring them home." The interrogation room at the Jackson County Station was a gray rectangle with a humming vent and a clock that ticked too loudly. Morning washed the frosted window with a colorless light. It could have been any hour at all inside that box. Curtis Hale sat with his cuffed hands flat on the metal table, head tilted as if he were listening to a song only he could hear. He had the gaunt look of someone who had been running on adrenaline too long, chapped lips, a bruise blooming at his jaw from the takedown in the warehouse. On the other side of the glass, Claire folded her arms and watched. Laura stood beside her, expression closed, a legal pad tucked under one elbow. A detective in a suit did the talking in the room, patient questions, a careful stacking of facts like stones across a river. At first, Curtis gave them nothing. He smiled without humor, shrugged, looked at the ceiling. "I don't know," he said. "Never seen those papers. Never seen those horses. You got the wrong guy." He understood the law well enough to skate just short of obstruction. He asked for water, sipped, smirked. He didn't ask for a lawyer, and Claire suspected he mistook that for control. They showed him the transport list, found on the desk by the cages. He rolled his eyes. They slid photographs of circular brands across the table. He shrugged. They played 30 seconds of body cam video from the warehouse, gaunt Mustangs packed behind bars, the stink of straw and urine, the sound of chains. His gaze flicked to the screen and away, as if it bored him. Hours passed. The clock kept grinding time down to grit. Claire said nothing, though. More than once her fingers curled into fists. She had not expected rage to feel so cold. Finally, the detective lined the photographs up in a neat row and spoke with a steadiness that carried fatigue like ballast. "This is your chance, Mr. Hale. Paperwork brands the warehouse. These will stand up in court. If you're not the one in charge, help us find who is." Curtis's lips quivered as if a word were trying to escape, and he was holding it between his teeth. Silence. 20 heartbeats. 30. He laughed once abruptly, the sound scraping his throat. When he looked up, his eyes had sharpened into something like defiance or surrender. "I'm not the boss," he said. "I take calls. I open doors. That's it." He leaned forward, the cuff chain clinking. "You want the real name. Find Mason Cade." Claire felt the floor tilt. The syllables landed with the dull weight of a stone thrown into deep water. She glanced at Laura. The deputy's jaw had tightened. Everyone in this part of Wyoming knew the Cade Ranch glossy website charity gala scholarships for 4-H kids. Mason Cade had a smile that owned magazine covers and a reputation lacquered in philanthropy. Spell it, the detective said, though he didn't need to. Curtis did. Then he slumped back in his chair as if something vital had bled out of him. Check the outbound bills under Cade Export. Check the Western Spur Road at his south pasture. Check the trailers. He let his eyes slide toward the camera in the corner and added almost spitefully, "He brands them. Not letters, shapes. Easier to deny." Behind the glass, Claire's breath left her in a thin, controlled ribbon. The puzzle that had been gnawing at her for weeks rotated and clicked. The midnight trucks, the clean trails, the brand like a ring of fire seared into flesh. A rancher wrapped in public virtue. Laura spoke low at her shoulder. "We'll need more than Curtis's mouth." "I know," Claire said. Her voice was steady. "We'll get it. They started with the scar." Dr. Samuel Harker met Claire in his exam bay that afternoon, the light outside already the color of pewter. Nix stood anchored under the heat lamps, a dark pillar, the bandages at his shoulder clean and tight. Harker rolled a cart closer, its top neatly arranged with a thermal camera calipers and a digital imager. "I want to take a second look," Claire said. "Not just for the file, for the pattern." Harker nodded, already lifting the lens. "Hold him steady." "Good boy," he added to Nix, his voice softened by habit. Images bloomed on the laptop screen in false color, and the layered heat signature that distinguished old scar from surrounding tissue. Harker measured, captured, compared. He pulled 3 older case files from a drawer and set their photos side by side, low-resolution paper ghosts from Nevada 2018. Circular brands, 1 triangle, 2 bars. "Here," he said, tapping the zoomed image of Nix's brand. "At 8 o'clock on the rim, see this notch?" Claire leaned in. In the pale ring of the scar, where the skin puckered inward, a tiny imperfection marred the circle. Not an accident, a deliberate bite out of the shape. When Harker enhanced the photo further, the notch's inner edge resolved into the faintest suggestion of a serif, a stylized hook that could be read as an M twisted sideways. "It could be coincidence," Harker said. "Metal warps. Flesh heals unevenly." His tone said he didn't believe in coincidence. 2 years ago, a similar mark turned up in a seizure downstate. Files went quiet after a judge sealed parts of the case. Mason Cade Clare said. The name felt like frost in her mouth. Harker looked at Nix, who had not flinched, who stood as though he had always belonged under bright lights and careful hands. He's been carrying evidence on his skin since the day they burned him, the vet said. And he came back to show you. Claire swallowed hard. She had no place for tears. What rose in her was a steadier thing. Resolve bare and iron. The search of the warehouse had produced more than misery. In the evidence room, Claire and Laura stood shoulder to shoulder over a folding table, while a federal liaison from the BLM, a woman with eyes like gunmetal, cataloged items with numbered stickers. There were crisp stacks of counterfeit transit documents, veterinary health certificates stamped with stolen seals from 2 Western states. Cross-border animal passports printed on paper that could fool a tired agent at midnight. A binder contained a price list indexed by color and confirmation bays, and chestnuts, cheaper duns and pintos fetching more. Anything docile enough to retrain, tagged for live export, anything unmanageable coded with a grim shorthand. A shipping schedule showed routes from Jackson to Long Beach with a column of port codes and a stamped destination in East Asia. A storage ledger listed feed syringes, tranquilizers. On 2 invoices, the logo of a company Claire had never heard of, Cade Export Solutions, sat as blandly as any legitimate freight arranger. In the center of it all lay a laminated sheet of shaped circles, triangles, angled bars, each paired with a number. A brand key. No letters, no ranch symbols that could be traced, just geometry anyone could deny. Global, the liaison said. Not your standard rustler. She turned a page with gloved fingers. When they want to launder contraband animals, they pass them through Sanctuary. Holding yard stack paperwork in triplicate and change trailers at county lines. By the time the container hits a port, the origin's a fairy tale. Claire stared at the sheet of circles until the edges blurred. He runs a ranch with a scholarship fund, she said. The words came out flat, not a question. Some people build churches with one hand and strike matches with the other, the liaison said softly. In the formal report, Nix's entry bore a sterile line, Exhibit A, living specimen, distinctive brand pattern consistent with illegal marking, observed PTSD response to diesel engine stimuli, cooperative behavior under care. Claire filed the report. Then she wrote a second document for herself and attached it to the case notes. He is not evidence alone. He is a witness. The last one standing who can still lead us into the dark places we would rather not admit exist. Without him, I would never have found the door. She closed the folder and slid it across to Laura. We press for a warrant on Cade Ranch, Claire said. We pull the satellite images for the South Pasture Road. We find the spur Curtis mentioned. Laura scanned the note's lips thinning. We've got enough to ask, she said. But he has money. Lawyers, friends in Rotary clubs and holiday parades. He'll wriggle. I don't need easy, Claire said. I need the truth. They stepped out into the parking lot, where the cold gnawed through denim and wool. Nix stood beside the horse trailer, steam rising from his back in faint curls. He'd taken to waiting for her like that, alert, but quiet, as if he had made himself a soldier in a war he couldn't name. Claire lay a hand against his neck. His skin twitched under her palm, a small warm shiver. We've only just begun, she murmured. This time we go all the way. Nix blinked slowly, the amber of his eye clear as glass. The wind carried the smell of snow and diesel and far-off smoke, and for once, Claire did not flinch from the engine's growl. She let it harden into purpose. The days after the raid slid by in a measured procession of work and winter. The county fairgrounds had been turned into a makeshift triage corral, panels welded into clean stalls, tanks of heated water chuffing steam into the cold, veterinarians and volunteers moving with quiet efficiency. One by one, the rescued horses were assessed, temperatures taken, hooves trimmed, wounds cleaned. Those with enough weight and strength were cleared for release. They would go back to the stony flats where snow broke in crusts and the wind wrote a hard kind of freedom across the grass. Others, too thin, too injured, too altered by what they had endured, were routed to rehabilitation in Utah, where sanctuary with a long waiting list had made room they didn't have, because sometimes the world required the impossible. News spread faster than snowmelt in spring. A photo of a gray mare cantering out of a stock trailer into a pale valley ran on the homepage of the Jackson paper, then jumped to a national feed. The image was almost too beautiful, tail-streaming nostrils flaring the white land, swallowing her tracks as soon as she made them, as if erasing the past one hoofprint at a time. Claire watched from the edge of a turnout pen as a bay gelding took his first tentative steps on unconfined ground. Volunteers whooped. Someone cried. The horse lifted his head, tasting air that didn't reek of rot, and broke into a gallop. She didn't cheer. She simply pressed her glove to the fence and said softly, "You're free now." Somewhere behind her, Nix tossed his head and answered with a quiet whicker. 3 days later, a government SUV slid into the station lot, trailing snow like a comet tail. Captain Denise Harrow stepped out, the federal badge at her hip, flashing dull silver in the winter light. She was tall and compact, her iron gray hair pulled back, her eyes bright with an energy that never quite softened. Claire had seen her only twice, once in a court hallway, once in a briefing room full of maps and men. Harrow shook Claire's hand with the firm grip of someone who had never liked ceremony for ceremony's sake. "You stirred a hornet's nest," she said, not unkindly. "And you did it well." Inside the small conference room, between a coffee maker and a cork board layered with notices, Harrow made it official. "We're standing up a federal wild Mustang anti-poaching task force," she said. "BLM Forest Service, County Sheriff, State Game Wardens. It's long overdue. We're done pretending the market doesn't exist because we don't want to see it." Claire listened, more relieved than triumphant. Harrow went on. "We'd like you to serve as field advisor for the state. Your maps, your methods, I want them operationalized. Training modules, patrol patterns, your instincts written down so others can use them." Something unknotted in Claire's chest. Not pride, not even vindication. Just the knowledge that the fight wouldn't live and die on the strength of one ranger in one patch of forest. Harrow's smile was small but genuine. "You didn't just save a dozen horses," she said. "You reopened a front we've let go quiet." "I never forgot it," Claire said simply. "Good," Harrow replied. "Then don't let the rest of us forget." By the end of the week, the paperwork was done. There were signatures and stamps and a site visit to her paddock. And then Claire Dawson was officially the legal custodian of one black stallion, Nix, under a special provision that recognized trauma and temperament beyond a simple wild versus domestic binary. She built him a new stall with her own hands. Timbers planed smooth. The roof sloped steep to shed snow. The gate swung on hinges that didn't squeal. She turned the opening toward the tree line so he could look at the wilderness and choose it every morning, by standing by, breathing, by being. On the gate, she hung a small plank. She sanded herself, then burned with a branding iron she heated in her own stove, Nix the Witness. The letters smoked as they darkened. For a long moment, she held the board, feeling the heat through her gloves, the bite of memory in the word witness. Then she bolted it to the rail and stepped back. Nix took to the new stall as if it had been waiting for him all along. He rose earlier than the light and stood facing the ridge, ears flicking, breath streaming white. He had not become tame. That wasn't the point. He had become steady. He let her lay her head against his neck without flinching. When she pressed her hand to the scar on his shoulder, he did not tense anymore. In her journal, Claire wrote, "We both have scars. Not all of them are endings. Some are maps back to the world." On a brittle, bright afternoon, Evelyn Ross and Deputy Laura Briggs arrived with a pickup bed full of seed flats and tools. They wore ridiculous knitted hats under their hoods and boots scabbed with mud. Evelyn hopped down with the energy of a woman half her age. "If we're saving lives," she announced, "we're going to need more color around here." "Therapy," Laura said solemnly, hefting a post hole digger. "For us, not the horse." They marked a neat line along the fence and planted sunflower seeds at regular intervals, pushing them into thawed pockets of loam with cold, reddened fingers. The ground gave grudgingly under the shovel. Claire laughed at nothing and everything until the sound felt like it had always belonged here, like the wind and the pines and the distant call of a hawk. "They'll track the light," Laura said, wiping her brow with a sleeve. Simple as that. No secrets. Wouldn't it be something if people did the same? Evelyn grunted. "Speak for yourself." I planned to lean a little toward coffee, too. They worked until their cheeks were raw and their hands were numb, and then stood back to admire the invisible row, trusting in the future they had buried in the dirt. The news broke a week later. Claire was filling Nix's water tub when her old radio on the porch crackled to life with a tone she'd learned to dread. She left the hose running and crossed the boards, wiping her hands on her jacket. "Breaking update," the announcer said, voice crisp with practiced gravity. "Authorities have executed a warrant at Cade Ranch in Sweetwater County. Owner Mason Cade has been taken into custody on suspicion of coordinating an interstate and international trafficking ring for wild mustangs." The announcer's words unspooled in quick, astonishing order. A multi-agency operation. A small armory of warrants. Seizures of financial records shipment manifests a cache of illegal branding irons. Images flashed across the small screen of Claire's phone as texts came in grainy shots of Cade being led in handcuffs past a line of white fence. Agents moving through a tidy barn where gleaming tack hung on pegs like trophies. Her phone rang. "Evelyn, it happened," Evelyn said without preamble. "He didn't wriggle. They've got him." Claire looked toward the paddock. Nix lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, amber eyes watchful. "It wasn't me," Claire said. "It was a horse who came back." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes that's how God writes it," she said, "with hooves instead of a pen." After she hung up, Claire stood with both palms braced on the porch rail, the old wood pressing into her skin. She didn't feel triumph exactly. Relief, the kind that came like air after too long underwater. Evening tilted toward gold. The wind eased, and the world seemed to exhale. Claire boiled water and made tea she didn't intend to drink. She carried the mug to the front steps and sat, her boots planted, her shoulders loose for the first time in months. Nix stood by the new stall with his head lifted. The low sun set his coat on fire. Black turned to molten copper at the edges, a halo catching along his mane and the curve of his back. Beyond the fence, the soil where they had planted lay dark and damp. Tiny green spears had begun to press out of it, insolent and certain. The first sunflowers of a season not yet born. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Nick swiveled an ear, then turned enough to face her, the line of his body easy. It felt like an answer, not yes or no, just a being in the world that needed no justification. The house, the trees, the fence, the waiting row of flowers, everything held still in a way that felt sacred. The forest would never be a place without secrets. There would always be another winter, another hidden road, another man with a smile too wide and a ledger too neat. But tonight, the balance had swung and clicked into place, and the land knew it. She did too. She took out her field journal, flipped to the final page of the case file, and wrote, "The scar on Nix's shoulder is proof of what should never have existed. It is also a reminder. Justice is not a gavel, not an ending, but a road walked through shadow with a choice again and again to keep moving toward the light. Some days we walk on 2 feet, some days on 4 hooves." She closed the book and set it beside her on the step. The tea had gone cold. She didn't care. "Home," she murmured. "We made it." Nix lowered his head in that small, solemn way of his, as if he understood the weight and the ease of the word all at once. The wind sifted through the pines and across the fence line where green had begun to bite through the earth, and the sky finally mercifully kept its promise of a clear night.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.